Thank you for that extravagant introduction, most of which is true. I'm very first pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to see students in the audience. I don't know if you were bribed with extra credit or not, it doesn't matter, that's all right. And to talk on this, this particular subject, which is, I think, very critically important at this moment. Since 9/11 particularly, I think American foreign policy has become extremely important, and I don't think most of us just going about our daily lives really understand just how and why it is so important. So what I'm hoping to do is to use some of the great classical works to try and illuminate what we could learn from their experience. So if we're talking about foreign policy, we're talking about how does a nation manage its allies, its rivals, and its enemies. And those often aren't necessarily three separate categories. You may remember, if you're old enough, in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, from mid-2002, the United States was trying to get the UN to pass, Security Council to pass a resolution, even though they'd already passed 11 resolutions basically calling for Saddam Hussein's ouster. They've tried to pass another one. And of course, our very close ally France was actively working against that resolution, lobbying the non-permanent members of the Security Council to vote against it. So when we say allies, rivals, and enemies, sometimes allies are rivals, or sometimes even behave like enemies. And if you're wondering why would the French do that, it's because the French had spent the 80s doing lucrative trade with Saddam Hussein's regime, did not want the sanctions regime to continue, had already preliminary to the total annulled to two national French oil companies that already signed lucrative contracts with Hussein to develop oil fields. So they had very understandable national interests, right? So just remember that, because when you hear the ostensible reason why a nation takes a position it does, take that with a grain of salt. There's usually some more, let's say, practical reason behind their behavior. And that's actually one of the lessons that we can learn. But why the Greeks? I'm going to concentrate mainly on the Greeks today rather than the Romans. I think there's two reasons. One, they happen to have left behind an extensive critical literature about these issues that nobody else has. You can't go back to the 5th century and find anywhere else a sort of an analysis of state behavior that you get in Greek literature. Not just in Thucydides, whom I'm going to speak about a lot today, but even in tragedy, even in comedy, in most of Greek literature. And so that's very valuable for us to have that insight. Secondly, we are connected to antiquity in the ancient Greeks in a way that we're not connected, let's say, to the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the ancient Egyptians. And that is because they created the idea of constitutional government. What I mean by that is, contrary to these other ancient empires, power is the private possession of the king, the pharaoh, and his elite, usually relatives, uncles, brothers, etc., that surround him. Power is a personal possession, and they use that power for their own interests. And you have the ruled, and then you have subjects. What the Greeks created is the idea of citizenship. These are the citizens as a collective who rule collectively through institutions, through laws, through procedures such as election, through very critical open deliberation of what the state should do, followed generally by a vote, by raising the hand. And that's completely remarkable for that time period. That our government is a descendant, through many twists and turns, obviously, it doesn't come down unchanged, through 2,500 years of history. Nonetheless, our political DNA can be traced back to the Athenian city-state. So they are similar to where we are today, and a lot of the problems identified by Thucydides, or by the history of the city-states in their relations with other states, we can recognize those connections. So there is what they say, this kind of analysis that they make, particularly Thucydides, and then there's also what they did that can provide a model. So I'll be talking about both of those dimensions. Thucydides records, as you know, records the history of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. It went from 431 to 404 BC. He tells that narrative, and he gives us those details, but he also has a kind of axe to grind. And so it's analytic in the sense that he does not believe in the Athenian radical democracy. And he sees the failures of Athens as a result of that political order. So that's going to be interesting for us today too, because a lot of the problems of foreign policy today are a reflection of the kind of government we have. When you have broad citizen participation in government, that creates certain consequences that make foreign policy difficult. And this was recognized, by the way, by de Tocqueville in his masterpiece, Democracy in America. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, you know, democracies are better at domestic policy than foreign policy. Because foreign policy requires long-term planning and sticking with it over time. And democracies at a certain level are hostage to their election cycles, aren't they? In Athens, that was once a year, that was every year. All terms, except for the strategoi, all terms were 1 year. For us, it's 2 years, isn't it? Because every 2 years we have elections for Congress. And so that tends to make short-sighted planning more attractive for politicians and for voters than long-term planning. So that's just that's another example of how, you know, there's this connection between the predicament we have today and what they face, and that makes it valuable as well. Now, what Thucydides teaches us that's extremely important for understanding politics and foreign policy is everything starts with, what do you believe about human nature? Why do people do what they do? Why do states do what they do? What are they after? Okay, that's going to reflect what they are. Okay, so are we basically rational creatures who, you know, sit down and make calculations and then plan? Or are we essentially irrational in the sense that we will do things collectively or individually that don't seem to make sense, that can end up being destructive for ourselves as well as others? So that's where we start. And Thucydides is the great arch realist about human nature. And I have a couple of very famous passages. Any excuse I get to read Thucydides, I like to read him. And the first passage comes from the very beginning of his history. And the war hasn't broke out yet. Everybody sees it coming, and they have a big conference. And these various states are there. Sparta's there making its case, and the Corinthians who don't like the Athenians. And there's an Athenian ambassador. I believe he's never really named. He's anonymous. But he makes one of the great famous statements of realism. And the criticism of the Spartans or the others is that, hey, you Athenians, you know, you talk about freedom and delivering us from the Persians, but then you've created this empire in which you subject other Greeks to your authority and extract tribute from them. All right? And so the Athenian, unlike probably us today, where our representative would try to make some sort of, you know, idealistic rationale for what we're doing, he says, an empire was offered to us. Can you wonder that? Excuse me. Acting as human nature always will. Now, that's the critical. Acting as human nature always will. We accepted it and refused to give it up again, constrained by three all-powerful motives: honor, fear, and interest. Right? Why do states do what they do? Right? Honor. That's what we would call, I think, today, prestige. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Right? Fear. The Spartans feared the growing Athenian power and assumed that it would eventually begin to encroach on their autonomy. So they were going to preempt that. And the other states that were commercial rivals feared the Athenians' growing domination of markets through their empire. So they also wanted to respond to that. And then interest is pretty straightforward. I mean, states you want more territory, you want more resources, you want access to more markets, you want to dominate your commercial rivals, dominate trade. But notice it's interesting. Idealism does not come into it at this point. Well, we're doing this to make the world safe for democracy. Right? The Athenians never would have thought of that. The Athenians happily enslaved other Greeks. Right? They had no sense that democracy is a universal good thing. It's like, hey, this is how we do it, and if you are a threat to our interests, then we're going to dominate you, we're going to subject you to our authority, or you're going to be our ally, but we're not going to let you fight against our interests. All right? That's realism, and it's based on human nature. And by the way, the people who created our Constitution, we call them the framers or the founders or whatever you want to call them, believed exactly the same thing. James Madison calls them passions and interests. He assumes that all people are motivated by these, passions and interests. For them, people were very passionate about religion, weren't they? You know, because you had different denominations there that clashed. Interests are just you want money, you want influence, you want fame or whatever it is that you want, and that's going to motivate your behavior. Now, he gives us another example of this. Thucydides does, and this is another very famous passage. It's in Book 3, in his description of the revolutions on the island, the modern day called the island of Corfu. He called it Corcyra. Once the Peloponnesian War started, you had to be on the side of the Athenians, you had to be on the side of the Spartans. City-states that were oligarchies tended to favor the Spartans. City-states that were democracies obviously favored and wanted to be on the side of the Athenians. Then you had states like Corcyra that had factions, one faction over the other, and they erupted into civil war. And Thucydides describes these civil wars and the brutality that they engendered and the breakdown of social order and mores that came out of this outbreak of violence. And then he after he describes these effects, he summarizes, and revolution, actually revolution is more like civil war. Now, the word in Greek stasis can mean civil war, it can mean revolution, it has a lot of different. Revolution brought upon the cities of Hellas many terrible calamities, such as have been and always will be, while human nature remains the same. Now notice this. This is very important. As the ambassador said earlier, human nature is constant. It doesn't change. It doesn't change. People are what they are. They act from the same motives. Now this is a very anti-modern thing to say, isn't it? For the last 200 years in the West, we have endorsed the ideal, the Enlightenment ideal of progress, of progressive improvement of human nature, if we eliminate all of the external environmental factors that have made people behave bad. Poverty, ignorance, religion, etc. If we get rid of all of those, and then people will develop and they'll become better, etc., etc. All right? Thucydides will have none of that. None of the Greeks would have any of that. It's like, no, there's a lot of empirical evidence in history that people aren't like that. Right? That constant through time is their irrational motivations, their interests and passions that drive what they do, and states are no different. They do the same thing. So you ask, well, then what's the lesson for foreign policy? The lesson for foreign policy is to understand what motivates people. Understand correctly what motivates people. The great Robert Conquest, he was one of the only guys early on talking about the Soviet Union's policy of famine and the number of people the estimates range from 20 to 30 million that were killed by the Soviet regime. And nobody, everybody poo-pooed him and didn't take him seriously. And then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, and they opened up the archives, and lo and behold, yes, indeed, he's been telling the truth. But he has a great essay, and he's talking about Soviet-era diplomacy between the West, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is during the period of détente. And you, annoyingly young people won't remember what détente is. I mean, annoying in the sense that I'm no longer young. Nothing wrong with you. It's just, every time I do this, I age, 5 years. And that was when, we need a rapprochement with the Soviet Union. We just sit down and talk to them and make a deal and soften things up, and et cetera. And Congress said, the biggest mistake a diplomat can make is to sit across the table from somebody and think that that person thinks the same way he does. And it's a failure of imagination not to figure out what does the world look like from his point of view. What's his motive? What's he after here? Okay. And he saw that as one of the failures of diplomacy in that period. And towards the end, if we have time, I'll suggest that we're making the same mistake today in our relations with much of the world. So the lesson is you have to try and see clearly what motivates people and not think that what we prize, what characterizes our motivations and our aims, is everybody's aims, because it's not going to be. And that they're all not rational. They are irrational from our perspective. It may be rational from their perspective, but from ours they are not. But we can't dismiss them and say, well, they just need to be schooled to understand how. No, that's a disaster. That's the explanation behind the disaster of the Munich Conference, September 1938. Right? The British simply could not fathom the kind of person that Hitler was, right? Until it was too late. So that's, I think, the great lesson of Thucydides. Now, another one is more specific to the nature of democracies. And this is a paradox, because what makes democracy so great is that they substitute verbal process and persuasion for force. And this is the great political lesson of Aeschylus's magnificent Oresteia, in which he moves from a world of blood vengeance and murder as justice to a world of a trial before a jury and verbal persuasion as adjudicating disputes and settling disputes. And that's a huge advance in civilization, right? Not force, but language and rhetoric. And these verbal procedures are how everything, all business in Athens is conducted. You have to remember, in ancient Athens, all political business is people standing in front of other people and speaking. Very little of it takes place through writing. I mean, they had laws written and they would keep records, etc. But if you went to the assembly, several thousand Athenians, and to make a motion for something that Athens should do collectively, go to war, make an alliance, whatever, you had to stand in front of those people and you had to persuade them. And then they would raise their hand and assent or not. So that's great. That's free speech, right? That's the essence of our political system. We don't resort to force, right? We rely on the system. I remember in 2000 again, I know you don't remember, you youngsters, but in 2000 in the disputed election of Bush-Gore election, and I happened to be that year at the Smithsonian doing a talk on Greek ways. And it's something remarkable, because as we came across the mall in Washington, and we got in the elevator down to the Smithsonian's lecture halls, I said, what didn't we see up there? We saw no tanks, we saw no artillery, we saw no troops marshaled lining the street. There was no threat of a coup, of a revolution over this disputed election that was going to give the most powerful military in the world over to one man rather than another. And that's the great glory of this system, that we don't immediately resort to violence as we see in other parts of the world today. But there's a downside to that, right? Verbal procedures take a lot of time, don't they? You have to let everybody have their say. You have to argue and dicker and, try to come to a consensus. In a moment of crisis, when you have an aggressor, that can be dangerous, can't it? And this is the lesson, I think, that we can take from Athens in the 4th century. Now, this is a fascinating period of history, not as well known as the 5th century, as the classical, the great tragedies and all that. The literature is not so hot in the 4th century as it is in the 5th, all right? But something very, very important happened in the 5th century for the Greek city-states. In 358, Philip II of Macedon came to the throne. And Macedon was like the sticks for the rest of the Greeks. All up in the north, they're barbarian. They're really into binge drinking. They have parties where 20 people will die of alcohol poisoning. They drink a gallon at a time. They also have some other unsavory habits, according to the Greeks, which I don't need to get into. But it was they just thought they're not Greek. They're not really Greek. They dismissed them. But Philip II, more so than his son Alexander, was brilliant. He created the army that Alexander would take to Persia to bring down the Persian Empire. And he was a brilliant diplomatist because he was a duplicitous diplomatist. He could manipulate people. He understood the city-state process of deliberation. He could manipulate that for his own interest. And he began to make his move south into the city-states of southern Greece. And by 338, the Battle of Chaeronea, the coalition is defeated by the Macedonians. Greek freedom is at an end. Now people will say, no, that's not true. They still had the assembly. They still passed motions. They had no autonomy anymore. You have to remember, political freedom for community means that there is no earthly authority above that community for what it does. Well, now there's a Macedonian garrison parked not far away. And you make all the motions you want, and you can do all the speeches you want, but you are not going to do anything the Macedonians don't want you to do. So it's a show. You've got the machinery of democracy is still working, but the substance is not, because if there's some authority that says, no, you can't do that, then you're not really autonomous. And this is the problem we see in the EU, don't we, today, that is starting, because the national sovereignty is been subjected to a transnational organization, and with the economic crisis, those interests begin to clash. And it's now a 50-50 bet if the EU can really survive. Okay, so the great hero of this period is Demosthenes, the great orator. For all the way into the early 20th century, when the French president Georges Clements wrote about Demosthenes. Demosthenes was the great hero of the Republican resistance to tyranny, because throughout this period, Demosthenes is making speeches to the Athenians saying, you can't mess around with this guy, right? You have to do something. You have to get your army, and you have to get your fleet, and you have to resist him in the north, at Amphipolis, for example, or Olympus, some of the northern Greek city-states that he was attacking. But part of the problem was this whole democratic machinery of deliberation and diplomacy and choosing an embassy and then sending the embassy to Philip, and then Philip telling them what he wants to hear and lying to them. Right? And then they have to come all the way back. Then they have to go back to the assembly and they have to say, this is what we're going to do. Then you have to talk about it all over again. Right? So the lesson is that diplomacy and the mechanisms of diplomacy favor the tyrant or the aggressor. They can also be used to create the illusion of action when there is no willingness to act. And Demosthenes has some great quotes on this. Thank you, Steele, for printing this for me. He says in one of his, I think it's the first Philippic in 351, for the swift and opportune, no, actually, excuse me, this is an earlier one. For the swift and opportune movements of war, this is Demosthenes, Philip has an immense advantage over us in the fact that he is the sole director of his own policy, open or secret, that he unites the functions of a general, a ruler, and a treasurer, and that he is always at the head of his army. He has nobody he's accountable to. Now, the Athenians entrusted war to 10 officials who were elected, one of the few offices that you could be elected to serially, called the strategoi. We sometimes translate that as generals. They weren't really generals. They were citizens elected to this board. And these 10 would then decide on policy. Now, the problem is the Athenians also had an instrument of accountability in which if a politician did something somebody didn't like, he could be brought up on charges. And then there would be these trials. And this happened all through the period. And one of this, I think it's Moses Finley, I'm not sure. Greek historian says, imagine during World War II if Churchill had to go before Parliament like once a week to defend some policy he was pursuing in conducting the war, with the possibility of being tried and convicted and sent into exile. Now imagine trying to conduct a war or a foreign policy with those constraints. And again, it's paradoxical because the accountability of those with power to the citizens is critical for political freedom, isn't it? They can't be arbitrary. They can't just make decisions. People are complaining now about the president's executive orders, etc. Yeah, but you know what? He's going to go out of office. Right? He can't pass an executive order saying, you know what, I want 3 terms, or 4 terms, or 5 terms. So that may be bad, but it's not nearly as bad as being on trial, perhaps for your life, because some of these charges could be capital crimes. And you can see where one of the great dimensions of constitutional government, accountability of those with power to the citizens, and when it comes to foreign policy, can be dangerous. And it is dangerous for the Athenians, who lose their political freedom and don't get it back until the revolt from the Turks, I think, in 1851. So this is one of the lessons that is important for antiquity. That we have this great political system, far superior to any other arrangement you could think of, including monarchy or an aristocracy or an oligarchy of some sort, or Plato's guardians, really creepy idea of his, but yet it does have its dangers, and its dangers are particularly manifest in foreign policy. And you say, well, what can we do about that? Well, I don't think there's anything we can do about that. The Romans had an office called the dictator. Recognizing this problem in times of crisis, they elected a dictator with term limits 10 years at most, and he was given more than ordinary powers to make decisions in times of crisis. Our president, as commander-in-chief, has a lot more leeway in times of war for independent action than in normal circumstances. All right, so when people look back to Lincoln and say, oh, well, look what Lincoln did, he suspended habeas corpus. That's allowed for by his powers as commander-in-chief in times of war or civil insurrection. So that's one of the kind of melancholy lessons that we have to think about, because it's hard to know what are we going to do about it. What can we do about it constitutionally? Right? We just have to rely on the good sense of the citizens and their electoral choices to do the right thing. So those are some of the issues that come up with the record of the Athenians and their struggle with Philip II. Another issue that very quickly is identified both in Thucydides and later on, factionalism. That there are different factions of citizens pursuing different ends, and that conflict can weaken the cohesion of the state when it is facing an aggressor. All right. Philip, for example, was very adept at identifying factions that he could bribe or that he could promote so that they would serve his interests rather than the interests of the whole. And this is the besetting, continuous flaw of representative democracy. You have all these different factions, they're all competing for power, for influence. And when you're facing an external enemy, you need cohesion, don't you? You need everybody on board, right? And if you don't get that, then it's very difficult to pursue a policy long term, consistently, and not have it change over and over. I'm going to leave time for questions, so I'm going to wrap up with this last point. And perhaps some of you have been seeing connections to where we are today. And I think where we are today is very much illustrative of some of the problems that we're talking about. It's no question, and this is not a partisan issue. If we had time, we could, go more extensively. But clearly, over the last 5 years, American foreign policy has been a disaster. All right, that's not a partisan estimation. That's just the reality. American influence has declined precipitously. Vladimir Putin, the leader of a failing state in the midst of demographic suicide, right? Without oil and gas, Russia would be, and of course nukes, Russia wouldn't be that important, is now the dominant player in the Middle East, backing Iran, backing Assad in Syria. We have no credibility anywhere in the world. We pulled out of Iraq precipitately, did not get a status of forces agreement, which could be had, right? The promise was made, President Obama made the promise, when he campaigned for president the first time, he campaigned explicitly against the war in Iraq and said, I'm going to end it and I'm going to bring the guys home. Great. Short term, politically, everybody likes that, probably had a lot of support among the people. Long term, that will be disastrous. And already we see, in addition to descending into sectarian violence of levels that, we haven't seen in years, Iraq is becoming closer and closer to Iran. Iraq currently is allowing Iran to fly over its airspace to deliver weapons to Assad, which is not in our interest. Okay. Afghanistan promises to be the same debacle. A lot of that's the problem of Afghanistan, which go back and read Shakespeare. Churchill's first book, the History of the Malacan Field Force, about 1880s, and the British experience with the Pashtun in Afghanistan, and you'll just be amazed. You'll read this and say, this is exactly what's happening today. It's exactly the same thing. It hasn't changed, So it could just be that region is what it is, but the possibility that after our withdrawal, the Taliban will once more in the border with Pakistan and the tribal areas establish a safe haven, the same place where Al-Qaeda had its training camps where the attacks in 9/11 were planned. Then we're back to where we were. And again, why? Because it's not just our leaders. We always like to blame our leaders for everything, but we put them in power with our votes, and we don't like ongoing conflicts. We don't like wars that go on and on. We like to, this is the American thing, go in there, clean it up, straighten everything out, and then go home. But that's not feasible anymore. That doesn't work. If you're France and you go into Mali, of course on our transport planes, because the French don't have transport planes, so they had to beg us to borrow them so we could fly their guys in there. Anyway, they went in there and they, cleaned up a little bit, then they went home. But see, France is no longer a global power. Don't tell the French that. They think they are. The actual fact is they're not. Right? They don't have the military, they don't have the means, the material, they just don't have the stuff for that. So that's one thing for them. For us, it's another, right? And so this issue of our system and its electoral cycles continually shifting and putting new people in power breaks that continuity. And it makes it very difficult to have that consistent, long-term, 20, 30, 40-year vision that we have to pursue through these electoral changes. It's very difficult for us to do that. And it's the great danger of democracy. So let me sum and then open it for questions. What can we learn about foreign policy from the ancients? One, you better understand human nature and the reality of human nature. That people are violent, they pursue their passions and their interests, they are ready to use force to do that. For some people, violence is a perfectly acceptable means of exercising power, unlike for us. For the state to use violence against its own citizens, it's no big deal. They don't have a problem with that as we do. You have to understand that. You have to think about their perspective, their vision, and if you sit down to talk with them particularly, you have to remember that. I think the disaster unfolding in Iran right now is a great illustration of that. Right? Because what's going to happen is Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon. And when that happens, that whole region is going to be transformed. And it's not going to be in ways that are beneficial to our interests and our security. And that's because, just like Philip II, they can use the process for their own ends, to buy time, to distract, to misdirect, to get sanctions relief, etc. All the time that the goal, in their point of view, is still being pursued. And again, that's a reprise of what happened in Munich in 1938. The second lesson is democracies are wonderful, great forms of government, but they have a profound weakness when it comes to foreign policy. And I don't know, maybe somebody has an idea of a solution to that. I think given the system we have, I don't think there is, unless there is a clear and present danger that obviously has to be greater than what happened on 9/11. That didn't seem to do the trick. Maybe something more existential that then they can, get on board and figure out what needs to be done and do it. But it's one of the prices we pay to have the system we have and the political freedom we have. So with that, I'll open up to see if anybody has any questions or complaints or corrections. I don't mind, if I misspoke. Thank you.